Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today we have Professor David Pan, who is a professor of German at UC Irvine and running for Congress in California 46. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm so excited to have this conversation. You are running as a Republican. I'm sure you know that, but just for listeners, and you are also involved and you've been teaching for the Humanities department at UC Irvine for the past several years. Generally, those two things do not go together, teaching humanities at a large public university and running as a Republican. How did you end up in this situation, and what has it been like, especially in the last year, being a very public Republican in a department and a school at UC Irvine, really not known for its conservatism?
Yeah, so I think what's happened to me is I think that the Democratic Party has changed a lot, but also universities have changed a lot. I don't feel like I have changed so much. So I used to be a Democrat. In fact, I was a Democrat until I was registered as a Democrat until last a year, into April, I believe, in 2023, when I switched parties. And part of my decision in running, I mean, I guess I had been voting more Republican for several years already, but had never really bothered to change my voter registration. But I think the broader point really is that, you know, when I got into academia, maybe whatever, 20, 25 years ago, there was still there were representation of different political perspectives at the university, right? There were obviously Republicans in schools of humanities and at universities. Now there are virtually none. I mean, I do believe that I am the single Republican in our School of Humanities, probably about 170 professors, right? And that's emblematic of this shift that's going on in higher education toward a kind of monolithic culture where you just get one political perspective. And that's been really disheartening, not just because I feel like my views are somehow isolated, but just because I think that has undermined the whole culture of debate and discussion at universities. So that's one issue, right? And in fact, that's one of the main issues that led me to say, oh, maybe what I'm doing at the university is, not so significant anymore because I can't do anything anymore. I mean, I can't get a speaker on campus. I can't, I can still publish things, but I don't think I'm getting a decent hearing from other people. And there's just so few other people who somehow even kind of respond to the types of framing that I make in my research, that I felt that, well, in order to really affect what's going on at the university, I really need to get out of the university. Because it's not something, I mean, because it's so monolithic, there's no way to change things from inside it anymore. It really has to come from outside, which, I think it makes sense. It's just that, I think there's a impression on the part of faculty administrators that the university should be dominated and controlled by the faculty and administrators. But in point of fact, universities are supposed to serve the public. And so the public should have a kind of decisive influence on what goes on at universities. And so that's why I've decided to go into politics, to talk to the public, to see what they think, to respond to what they think, and to try and implement policies that would reassert this control over universities by the broader public. Well, that's part of your answer, but why don't you?
No. So I want to eventually move us into the future of the university and everything there. We'll get there in a couple of minutes. I mean, just some thoughts. I mean, it obviously skews students' perspectives of the world when, if you graduate with a degree from the School of Humanities and all of your professors have not even been, centrists or capital L liberals, but been progressives, their view of the world, I mean, is just so colored by obviously that experience. And it's not only that some of their views of the world are a little bit wacky, we'd probably both agree on that too, even if, maybe we disagree on some, finer points of policy. It's that they're not actually prepared to go into the quote unquote real world where you do get this whole spectrum of opinion. I mean, even just, thinking a couple podcasts ago, I talked to a George Mason professor, and he wrote a book about Jews and DEI and race and all of that. And he's very much on the, classical Martin Luther King Jr. try to not see race and try to be colorblind. That when I was growing up in elementary school, middle school, or high school, that was the liberal slash progressive thing to do. And that has obviously shifted, and we can debate the merits of that shifting. But a couple of students listened to that. And I remember I got a text from one person and said, "Oh, this guy sounds really far right." And I was thinking to myself, I'm like, no, 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 no. The really far right people actually want segregation in some sense. Once you dip, right? It's the liberals, right? Capital L, and the classical conservatives that are in the middle that actually, do see the merits of, maybe some type of behind the scenes, in some way affirmative action, whatever. We can debate that. But this entire infrastructure of DEI and reducing everything to race is obviously, poisonous for a cohesive society. The other thing, and I'm curious if you have thoughts about this, I'm sure you do. I've noticed in the last couple of years a really a switch, and I think the switch has been a little bit subtle, but obviously since October 7th, it's been more explicit, from university professors viewing their roles as educators to now activists in some sense. And we saw this, of course, with many professors and faculty departments and, graduate students coming out, explicitly against Israel, some even in support of Hamas post October 7th. What's interesting for me to reflect is that you're sort of doing the same thing, but on the other side. From what I'm hearing, you are in some way, what you're saying is you're giving up on the university's ability to educate in a proper way. And, what I would imagine we'd both agree a proper way is you end a class, say, on economics, understanding multiplicity of theories of economics and the merits and detriments of all of them, not one way and all the other ones are, stupid and immoral. But it seems like you're also in some way giving up on that and saying, I need to actually run for office where I could be in charge of some of the decisions as opposed to trusting the educational system. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this, wider shift.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, the first place I agree with you that I feel also that I've kind of stayed the same in terms of my views, but the university has shifted to the left, and so this kind of colorblind idea of being colorblind, Martin Luther King and equality and equal opportunity for everybody. Yeah, it's strange that that should become considered a far right position now, but that seems to be what's happened. That is kind of generally the position of the Republican Party. But the Democrats have kind of abandoned that idea and moved toward this affirmative action idea. And so I think that's the first thing that I think is very important to understand what's going on at the universities, that shift has really marginalized perspectives that I think really are very legitimate, right? And are not don't seem to be open to discussion and debate anymore. And so that's precisely the issue is, I'm not, I still believe in this ideal of a university as a place where you can have discussion and debate. You should have differing perspectives that face each other, and that students should be educated by looking at these different perspectives and being able to evaluate them. And then, but what seems to have happened, because we've become such a monoculture that there is only kind of the liberal left perspectives that are being represented, I think that has contributed to the sort of activist mentality amongst faculty, because there's such agreement on these basic issues. Then the disagreements then only arise in terms of the tactics and the strategies of how you implement these ideas that I think generally are held at the universities to be sort of common sense ideas, and everybody else seems to be wacko, right? And so, and that's how, I think that's part of how the educational process has been turned into a kind of political activism. And so that's part of it. And then, in order to return some kind of balance, we ultimately need to have some way of I'm not sure how, but reintegrating professors who have been marginalized in this process, but they're so marginalized they're not even there anymore, right? And so, and it goes all the way down where, recruiting graduate students, you've got the same kind of professors recruiting their grad students, they're recruiting the people that resemble themselves, right? And so the people coming through the pipeline are going to be, you know, reproductions of those same faculty. This wasn't the case, whatever, 70s, 80s, when there was this kind of shift, in fact, where, you know, you had a lot of conservative professors that were willing to allow in people with the different perspectives, more left-wing liberal perspectives. But then this got undermined in the sense that once the liberal left-wing professors came in, they basically shut things off for conservatives to come in. So, you know, these are such fundamental problems that have become so endemic to universities that in terms of, I mean, I'm not an activist at all as a professor. You know, I really try very hard in my teaching to present lots of different conflicting perspectives. And I don't actually, I try not to actually come down on the side of any one of those, but really try and, you know, help students evaluate them all independently of my opinions. And so, but, you know, the activism, I don't think should happen at the university. And so that's really part of my decision to go outside of the university to be politically active, right? So, I guess I agree with you in that political activism shouldn't be the job of the university. Education should be the job of the university. Political activism should go on outside. And so I guess that's partly why I'm doing outside the university, but it's also because of this problem where universities themselves, they've gone so far over in suppressing. You'd have to say suppressing alternative perspectives that there's no way to reform it from inside at this point. I don't think
Yeah,
it's
well, I
really hard
wonder
to
if
imagine.
October 7th, I mean, I've been saying for this year, I mean, you know, we're obviously gearing up towards another school year. You know, God knows what to expect when the UC start at the end of September. Obviously, this past year, I think the UC system and really just schools in general were caught by total surprise by October 7th. I don't think anybody could have predicted the subsequent reaction. Sure, a couple of fringe student groups, you know, Students for Justice in Palestine and maybe the, you know, Marxist Student Union, whatever, fine. Maybe they would have, you know, tacitly supported, you know, the Hamas attacks, but I don't think anybody would have predicted the just sheer support of, you know, unions and professors and graduate student groups of some of, you know, really one of the worst terrorist attacks really in world history to some extent. I've been saying for a while, and I generally tend to be optimistic about the world, that this is going to be a wake-up call in the grand scheme of things. You know, I don't think it's going to happen immediately, but I can imagine looking back in 10 years, and if universities are able to reform either from the inside or from external pressure, I think we'll be pointing back to the 2023-2024 school year as one of the inflection points of, okay, it just got so insane that now supporting Hamas was a de facto normative view among professors and graduate students. Something needs to shift, because how do you have, you know, the finest universities in the country, many of whom are paid by, you know, taxpayer dollars and, you know, funded by, you know, California taxpayers, are funding graduate students and professors at UC Irvine, and to have them support a terrorist group who has explicitly sought to destroy not just Israel, of course, but also America in the case of Iran and Hezbollah and the Houthis and all these other groups. Something has to change. I mean, it's so broken. I don't even see how it stays as it is. I mean, I'm curious if you have thoughts about the future of a university and even just the feasibility given what we've seen over the last couple of months.
Well, you are optimistic, and that's good. But I don't think there's any kind of necessity for that change. That kind of change, I think, I mean, I certainly hope that this past year will be a turning point for universities. But that will only happen if um, people step up. People say this is a problem and we need to do something about it. And that because the problem goes very deep, and it's a very long-term problem, because it really involves how the universities, the faculty, the administrators have shifted over time over the last, you know, say 30 years, to become the way it's become. And the structures have then been established that have reinforced those attitudes. to create a shift back, it's going to take I think it could take another generation, and it'll take a generation in which people are committed to this kind of change, whereas they're not, they're clearly not committed to that kind of change within universities, right? And so, um, yeah, there's no, I mean, uh, I'm a professor of German, and so I deal with literature, philosophy, politics, history of Germany, and I have a very strong sense of how things can go bad to worse. And obviously, in the case of Germany, things were great. Germany was a fantastic country all the way around, at the beginning of the 20th century, right? But things just got bad and worse and worse and worse. And there's no necessary kind of turning point. Um, the only kind of turning points happen when people, um, yeah, become engaged, yeah, I guess you're right. I mean, I was horrified. Lots of people were horrified by October 7th. But to turn that into, real activity that would change things, that's going to take a lot of work, and would take a lot of commitment. And, because at root, the problem is not just a kind of I don't know what you call it, like a temporary political one. It's about ideas that have taken hold at universities and have become basically kind of a doctrine at universities about what, yeah, what constitutes moral, ethical behavior within the political realm. And one of the basic principles now is that, if you're a victim, you're automatically somehow good. And that is the problem, right? Because then they see any kind of victimization, any kind of harm as somehow evidence for that person being worthy of support. So even if terrorists are being killed, that means they're the victim, and somehow they're the ones that need to be protected, need to be defended, and that obviously doesn't make sense. We need to realize that different ideas have different moral political valences, and we need to look at that. We need to look at the comparison between something like equal opportunity and respect for human rights and something like a branding of people based on their ethnic identity and immediately somehow opposing them because of that, or because of their race. And we're categorizing people in terms of race or ethnic identity rather than treating each person equally. I mean, that seems to be a pretty basic kind of moral perspective to take, but that has been undermined by a different kind of ideology that doesn't see things from that perspective, but really wants to somehow, I guess, yeah, see things from this idea that anybody's a victim, oppressed is somehow good. I mean, that's the strange shift that's taken hold, but that has taken hold, and that people are committed to that perspective, and I guess perhaps there's some um, seductive force there because they, obviously right now people see, Palestinians dying, but they don't really think about why it is that they're dying and who's at fault there. And so anyway, but overall, I'm happy about your optimism, but I think it'll take lots of effort.
Yeah, no, I mean, just reflecting, I mean, it's so funny because have been teaching for the last 4 years at UCI. The classes have about 50 students each, and, I tend to get to know most of them pretty well. And most students, when you actually talk to them, also think this entire framework is absurd. And the students that I'm talking to, I mean, these are history majors and political science majors. I'm not talking to, the engineering majors who, I'm making a generalization, of course, but, they don't, care at all about, most of this. They just want to get a degree and get a high paying job. But even those that are in more, say ideological based degrees, the majority of undergrad students, even at a very progressive university, still seem to think a lot of this is crazy and would still say, cancel culture is a problem and would still want to hear out opposing views. So it really does seem like we're in a system where it's just everybody's too afraid to go against the loudest voices in the room because those loud voices really will stop at almost nothing to condemn anyone who they think is sort of on the wrong side. I mean, we saw this at UCI, of course, with the posters around campus with Jeffrey Kopstein and the Chancellor Gilman and Hal Stern, the provost, who, dared to stand up to, pro-Hamas encampments on campus. And, all of a sudden they have, wanted posters with their face all over campus. If I'm an average person, say I'm an average professor that has, tenure in, say whatever department, an English department, and I think the encampment is awful and I understand what the Intifada is, but I also, want to enjoy my life and not have, mobs show up at my house, which is what has happened, both in the case of Chancellor Gilman, it's happened in the case of a lot of politicians. I can understand why a lot of people would just say, you know what, I'm just gonna, sit this one out and be quiet. I'm not excusing that moral behavior, but it really does seem like, the reason why I think I'm more optimistic is that I don't think we have to change the minds of 80% of people on campus. We have to either change the minds of 10% of people on campus or convince 30% of that 80% to say, hey, you can actually stand up to these bullies and it's actually going to be worse for them. I'm not going to sit here and have somebody call me a colonialist white supremacist. I'm going to say, no, 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 you're just a terrorist supporter. Let's not confuse this. I'm a liberal who stands for equality and feminism and LGBTQ rights and, equality of religion. It's actually your side, that's supporting Hamas and Iran and Hezbollah that is the racist, sexist, bigoted society. So I guess that's why I'm a little bit more optimistic. I did want to move on a little bit because obviously my ear is very close to the wider Jewish community in Orange County. It's a very interesting election because I've remarked in several other podcasts, Jews obviously vote predominantly Democrat. They've done so for about 100 years. I think this election, things could change, but there are two issues that continuously come up in the Jewish community whenever anybody suggests voting Republican. Probably not going to be a surprise for you. They are Donald Trump at the top of the ticket and also abortion rights. So I'd love for you to comment. I mean, what would you say to somebody who agrees with everything you've said so far, and maybe even the issue that's the most important to them is anti-Semitism and all of these things that we've been talking about, but let's start with Trump. They just can't get behind a party where Trump is at the top of the ticket. They're afraid that he is not going to say that the election was fairly won, whatever happens, in November. I mean, how would you answer that type of voter?
Well, I guess I can just give you my perspective
Yeah.
on Trump, is that, he spent 4 years in office, and, things didn't fall apart in 4 years. He did lots of crazy things. He said lots of crazy things, but ultimately, the country held together pretty well, and in some ways, really prospered. And we didn't have this kind of breakdown in international order that we've had under the Biden administration. And ultimately, what Trump has brought. I mean, the positive aspect of Trump is that he's brought into the national debate and conversation and politics this perspective of kind of lower class, less educated voters who really were shut out of the entire political process. And I think that's a valuable thing. I mean, the Republican Party is very different than it was before Trump came in. I think, and I think I was part of that. There was an impression that the Republican Party was kind of the party of the rich, party of people who didn't care about rights for other races or for minorities, or yeah, but but that has really shifted where really because of Trump, I think the Republican Party is now much more aligned with the lower classes. And part of that is the less educated classes, but kind of working class people. And those people really, I mean, they need to have a right to be heard. And Trump has been amplifying their voice or trying to kind of represent them in some way. Um, I think we have lots of disagreements about, the best things for them or best things, for the country. And you don't have to agree with everything that Trump does or says in order to agree that the Republican Party is clearly the party now that supports equal opportunity rather than categorizing people by race or ethnic status, right?
I guess
Uh,
just to push back, I mean, this is just, I think relevant just for the background or floating around. You're sort of talking about policy that maybe one would agree with or not. Then it totally makes sense why a lower class person from the middle of the country would support Trump. I mean, and it's not because they're racist or stupid. It's because of policy and certain things that Trump is saying. A lot of people that are existentially afraid of Trump, not against Trump because of policy, are more focused on, say, January 6th and those type of things. And so even if somebody, obviously you can give somebody the platform of the RNC and the platform of the DNC, and maybe even the Republican platform makes more sense for a lot of people policy wise. I think, January 6th has become this sort of, the elephant in the room of a lot of people saying, well, even if I agree with Trump on 80% of policy compared to only 20% Democrats, I just can't risk the, threat to democracy that Trump might be not being able to give over the reins of power or not admitting that he lost in the case of the next election. Do you think that's an overblown worry, or are you also worried about, January 6th and if something like that could happen again?
Right. I do think it's an overblown worry. The main reason, I guess, is because I think the problem with Trump is not so much a kind of what do you call it, dictatorial ambitions, but I think his difficulties in dealing with setbacks and his. I think there's a kind of, I don't know, psychological issues there, I suppose, but they're not of the sort that would lead to the dissolution of democracy. And I think the best evidence of that was his behavior during the pandemic, because the pandemic was really a golden opportunity for him to take over dictatorial control of the country. I mean, he would, in fact, it would have been Democrats almost that would have more supported him, declaring a state of emergency and like enforcing very serious lockdowns and kind of treating the United States the way Xi Jinping treated China. But he did not do, he did quite the opposite. And basically was allowing people to do what they wanted to, rather than using that as an opportunity to take over this kind of dictatorial power. So I don't think that he has the, I don't know what you call it, the ambition to undermine democracy, nor
Yeah, I
really
don't
the
think he
will
has
to
the
do that.
ambition. I mean, just to reflect, I don't think Trump is sitting there, behind a smoke-filled room, drawing up plans to take over the country. I mean, there are some people who think that. I just think his personality, it just seems to be a lot more of the sort of sense of being a sore loser, right? So it's not that he's trying to take over. It's just, if you beat me in a game of poker, I take my money back from the table and just storm out and say, you were obviously looking at my cards, right? It's not that I came in with the intent to, cheat you out of your money. It's that I came in thinking, well, of course I'm going to win. I'm the best. And then you beat me at poker and I just say, this whole thing is rigged because there's obviously a hidden mirror that
Right.
that's more, I think, my worry about
Right.
Trump than.
But that to me, this kind of personality issue, or what I call the kind of psychological, his own personality and the way he reacts to things. I don't think that that's a particular threat to democracy. I mean, clearly what happened in January 6th, I mean, it was not a serious threat to our democracy. I mean, it was chaotic. It was obviously awful for it to happen. But I don't think anybody for a moment would have thought that somehow whatever happened there would have somehow destroyed our democracy. And it's kind of yeah, I mean, it was much more like a riot that got out of control, I think, than anything else. I mean, there were these people who were, had these weird plots and stuff like that. But, ultimately it was, in the scheme of things, a relatively, innocuous, I mean, innocuous in the sense that it was not going to bring down our democracy. What it did obviously um, hurt the way in which our political discourse was maintained and overturned some precedents and some customs, right? That was very unfortunate. But that has happened on both the Democratic and the Republican side. I mean, the repeated use of impeachments against Trump. I mean, I think that that was also something that undermined certain, customs and habits of our democracy. So, yeah, I don't particularly think that event by itself would be evidence of a danger to democracy. Yeah, I mean, it happened also, but all of our institutions were pretty solid in the wake of that.
Yeah, interesting. And obviously, one of the first things that the next class of Congress might be asked to do is certify election results. So you're not worried, say, if Trump does lose by some small number of votes, you aren't worried about Republicans in Congress or yourself. You wouldn't feel pressured to say, I'm just gonna, either refuse to elect, Harris or anything like that.
Yeah, I just don't see that as a serious threat. I mean, obviously people can, there could be some minority of Republicans that somehow do that, but I just don't think that that's going to decide things. And I just it's hard to imagine a situation where somehow, one person would win the election and somehow the other one would somehow undermine that result, seriously undermine that result. But Yeah, I guess I don't see that as the problem as a structural problem with the Republican Party. That's I think because your initial question of why
Hmm.
vote for Republicans if this could somehow lead to the destruction of our democracy. I don't think that's the issue with the Republican Party. There might be an issue with, like I said, the specific kind of personality traits of Donald Trump, but that's clearly something that I don't think affects the general structure and perspective of the Republican Party.
Yeah, it's one of those things that, I never really know what to make of the alarmism. And I think you see it on both sides. I'm bringing this up because you had mentioned, early 20th century Germany, which of course was probably the most progressive place in the world. There's actually a sad, I mean, in retrospect, but a essay written by Hermann Cohen, who was a well-known Jewish thinker in Germany, who was a notable anti-Zionist. Just for listeners, it meant something very different to be an anti-Zionist in 1920 than it does now, right? Sort of in my head, the difference between deciding you don't want to have a child versus wanting to kill a child once it's born, right? Is the difference between being an anti-Zionist pre-state of Israel versus post-state. So a very normative position, especially in the German Jewish community. And he writes this essay talking about, messianism. And he says, Zionism in some senses is the Jewish giving up of messianism. I've discussed this before on the podcast for listeners to understand why. And he basically says, here in Germany, this is actually our best shot at messianism, right? This is exactly what the prophets imagined of, the lion laying with the lamb and a multicultural society and beating the swords into plowshares. And it's always striking to see just how wrong he was. I mean, just the extent of magnitude of going from, 20 years from saying we're living in pre-messianic times, isn't this great, to probably objectively the worst situation in human history, the Holocaust. When people try to make comparisons in American politics, and you see this on both sides, right? You see people on the left saying that Trump is, a fascist Hitler-like, figure, and then you see people on the right, say, what the left is doing is, equally fascist, or specifically Jews that, are planning on voting Republican will say, well, the anti-Semitism in America is exactly how it started in Germany in the 1930s. I mean, what do you make of these comparisons to Nazi Germany? I mean, on the one hand, obviously studying history, right? You want to be able to make comparisons, but it's always struck me as somebody who's spent his whole life hearing both about the Holocaust. I have grandparents and great grandparents who are survivors, and also just being around in the political world. The number of times people compare things to the Holocaust and Hitler is sort of, every 20 minutes. And so what do you make of, in a general sweep, when people try to make these comparisons, regardless of which side?
Well, so I think in general, when people compare anybody to Hitler, it's generally, I think, done in a irresponsible way. But that's not to say that there aren't any comparisons that you could make. So I think it's clear that, there's no way in which you can compare Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler. I mean, when Adolf Hitler became chancellor, right? Basically, his first move was to establish the Enabling Act, which gave the chancellor, gave himself the power to enact laws directly without the legislature. You know, Clearly there's nothing comes close to that, in the Trump administration. That was clearly a move to become a dictator, right? He was the one he basically took away the power of the legislature to make laws and gave it to himself, right? Um, there's nothing comparable that's going on in the United States at all today. Um,
And what
the
do you make about anti-Semitism when Jews, people in the Jewish community, this is a really interesting debate internally within the Jewish community. I mean, people saying, in the most crude form, just to parrot the debate that, is heard all around at Shabbat tables, somebody saying, Jews should move to Israel. It's not safe in America. Someone else saying, what the heck are you talking about? Jews are doing great in America. And then the person saying, well, Jews were doing great also in Nazi Germany, but then things slowly creep until they just snowball. And, this really could be some sort of parallel.
Yes. So yeah. So that was the other thing that I was about to say. Really, is that that doesn't mean that there aren't parallels with anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. But the main parallels, I think, really, and the main threats to democracy really are coming from the Democratic Party and not from the Republican Party, precisely on this issue of anti-Semitism, um, because I do think that the kind of ideology that's supporting anti-Semitism, which really is there's a kind of left-wing anti-Semitism that links Jews to whites and white supremacy and colonialism, right? That seems to be kind of the logic here is that if you're attacking Jews, it's not because they're Jews as such, but it's because they're allied with this whole complex of things of white supremacy and colonialism that needs to be attacked. But that particular perspective then is the one that can snowball, right? That is undermining basic principles of our liberal democracy, which includes this idea of equal opportunity and liberal values of defending individual rights. And so that that slide conceivably could become worse and worse and worse. And so it would be kind of, I guess, maybe ironic or strange that the kind of anti-Semitism that we see and I see the most serious threats to democracy are the ones that are coming from the left today. And that I do think needs to be taken seriously. I do think that could create this sort of slide. And clearly the attacks, the Hamas attacks were the best example of that. I mean, if you want to think about the closest approximation to the Holocaust, clearly Hamas is the closest one. I mean, if Hamas took over, imagine if Hamas took over. They had taken over Palestine. Let's say that Iran and Hamas and the Houthis they take over the Middle East. You would have probably something similar to the Holocaust. I mean, it's pretty clear. That's what they're saying. They want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. How do they want to do that, right? And they've demonstrated how they want to do that with the October 7th. And so there clearly are parallels to the Holocaust. We're seeing them today, but a large portion of the Democratic Party does not recognize that, and in fact, even has been supporting in some bizarre way has been supporting Hamas. That really, to me, is the big danger, and that's where you can start seeing some parallels.
Yeah, and it seems like the Democratic Party is really split down the middle on this issue. I mean, we're obviously talking now Tuesday of the DNC week, so we're still yet to have a lot of speeches centering around Israel. I was very impressed at the RNC to see how much Jewish support and content there was. I mean, even if again, I'm still a Democrat, I'm still almost certainly going to vote for Harris in the next election, but it was very refreshing to see, you had a hostage family speak at the RNC, you had this student Shabbos Kestenbaum who is suing Harvard, and just the acknowledgement of the anti-Semitism in the country. The problem that I've been having with a lot of Democrats, and not all of them, of course, but they're belittling the amount of fear that I think a lot of Jews in the country are feeling. It's like they don't even understand why this is so problematic. And I think it's because what you said is correct. There is this assumption of, well, there's just a bunch of white people who happen to believe in a religion called Judaism. So who cares if they're hurt, right? They're all, in the upper class anyway. I mean, in the most, but not, in the most simplistic form of the left. I mean, is this something that you think is just endemic in the Democratic Party? Is this just the fringe that's sort of pulling the rest of the party? Is it something inherent within the mindset of the Democratic Party? I mean, how would you sort of, tease this out?
No, I don't think it's endemic. It's just there's a faction of the Democratic Party um, that wants to defend Hamas or the Palestinians in a way that would ally themselves with Hamas. That's a huge problem. I mean, I think that the basic issue, the broader issue with the Democratic Party is that they have bought into this, basically the affirmative action ideology that says that we need to be categorizing people by race or gender or ethnicity in order to somehow fix the problem of racism. But I mean, you can't fix the problem. I mean, I totally agree with the Supreme Court on this, the recent decisions that you can't fix the problem of racism by instituting policies that divide up people by race. You really have to, I mean, I totally agree that we need to have a kind of colorblind approach in which we say, no, we're going to judge people as individuals and not as members of a group. But it's fundamentally this process of judging people based on their membership in a group. That's what led to the Holocaust. I mean, clearly the Germans were treating the Jews not as individuals; they're treating them as members of this group, and that's the huge problem. And clearly, lots of Democrats adhere to this policy, mostly with good intentions, I suppose. But despite the good intentions, it's having this horrible effect, and it's leading us toward these very dangerous situations.
Yeah, they also just don't seem to know. I mean, we were talking before about campus administrators and how just wholly unprepared they were for the campus backlash after October 7th. And it's because most of the time when, hyper progressive ideas are administered at a university, there's very little pushback, right? So, college Republicans are such a small percentage of any big university in the country. I mean, no one really cares if they're, steamrolled over in terms of programming, whether or not that's good or bad, that's a separate question. But I mean, Jews in the Jewish community make up, huge chunks of these universities. And so there really was this internal schism between two groups who see themselves as quote unquote minorities that are in need of defense, and the entire DEI infrastructure it's like it didn't know how to handle it. It sort of, out computed itself to the point where now, no, really, I mean, it's almost like this satire. I mean, I'm pretty sure a couple of years ago, it might have been SNL or something, but it was something that I was surprised because it was quite a liberal, comedic show. Basically had a video of, a girl going off to college, and, I think it was in this case, the Taliban, van pulled up, and she got in and said, bye mom and dad. And they're like, be safe. And it was sort of like a joke. Haha. People experiment with radical ideologies in college. But I mean, that quite literally is what we've been seeing. And so it'll be really interesting to see how campus administrations handle this moving forward. I mean, I just saw, the UC Regents just put out a zero tolerance policy for encampments or masking. We'll see if they actually enforce their policy. I mean, the problem this past year wasn't, at least from my understanding, the problem wasn't policy, it was enforcing policy. I mean, they have the
Exactly.
policy, right?
Right.
You're not allowed to sleep in the middle of campus, right? It's, do you get kicked out and arrested when you sleep in the middle of campus? But I don't know. I mean, are you expecting, I mean, obviously, never good to predict the future, but what are you expecting to see from this upcoming school year, either at UC Irvine or just beyond federally?
Well, I guess it depends on the decisions that these administrators make. I mean, I think that this was it's a directive from the President Drake about, to the campuses that they should be enforcing the rules that they have on the books. And essentially, they haven't been doing that in the last year, and that has been incredibly detrimental to, to the campuses in general, as well as Jews in particular on the campuses. But I mean, Drake's pronouncement, it comes, it's a week after the court judgment against UCLA, saying that they have been, that they've been endangering or damaging the rights of Jewish students, and UCLA has been ordered basically to enforce its own rules, right? And so so President Drake's announcement is really basically an attempt to comply with the court order, right? And so so I mean, I think again, this is a case where the universities have not really wanted to enforce their own rules even when it comes to this type of, I guess, progressive protest, right? And it has the real relief has to come from outside. In this case, it's a court order. It'll in the future it'll have to come from voters as well. Ultimately changing the composition of the regents of the University of California so that they can exercise more control over the president and the administration. But yes, I mean, I agree that this type of activity has been, it's been a consequence not so much of students. I mean, obviously the students have been pushing this, but it's the administrators that have really allowed it to mushroom into this horrible experience that we've had in the last year. I mean, I can't predict what's going to happen, but my sense is that, with the court order especially, that'll really, limit the amount of limit to the extent that student protests then snowball into these kind of riots and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I have no doubt that, history classes and humanities classes across the country are going to be as toxic, as pernicious as they always were in terms of,
Yes.
just the activism that's masquerading as, good education, but we'll see what happens there. So I have two more questions. You've been generous with your time, and then, happy to pass the mic to you in case we missed anything. So say it's a year from now, you've been elected to Congress, and, it falls to you to, draft some Middle East proposal. I mean, how you deal with Hezbollah in the north of Israel, how you deal with Iran, how do you, navigate giving aid to Israel. I'm curious if you have just sort of broad thoughts about, what do you think the Biden administration has done wrong in the last couple of years with the Middle East, and what would you have wanted to see?
Well, recently, the Republicans in the Senate have proposed some really, I think, common sense policies regarding the Middle East, about, for instance, really having much more of targeting Iran, for instance, right? Really saying that, things that are being carried out by Hezbollah and Hamas, need to be brought back to Iran. And clearly Iran is behind a lot of this, and that holding Iran accountable, and having the U.S. really back up Israeli threats of responding directly to Iran when things like, the October 7th events happen. I think that would be, a first step in doing something in order to improve the situation. But really, I mean, overall, in general, understanding that what we're involved with internationally is a situation where these sort of authoritarian, but also authoritarian capitalist regimes, including Iran, Russia, and China, are the ones that are really threatening, fundamentally human rights, national sovereignty, and ultimately, the freedom of the United States and the rest of the world, to be, able to determine their own destinies. I mean, if you think about it, Iran is really trying to establish a kind of hegemony over the Middle East, and pushing through its own, anti-Jewish, anti-Israeli, but also Islamicist policies. And so that's something that the United States really, I think, he needs to stand up to in a way that I don't think the Biden administration has been doing adequately either in the Middle East or in Ukraine.
Interesting. So this last question might seem like a out of left field for listeners. You'll immediately see where I'm going. There's a big, say, ethical philosophic debate about the feasibility of separating a intellectual or an artist from their work in terms of who they were. You're obviously, you study Carl Schmitt, who is a notable political thinker. He was also very involved with the Nazi Party. I'm curious how you think about this question in sort of broad strokes of taking the, say, intellectual achievements of people who were involved in, some of the worst human activity. I mean, is this something that you've struggled with, think about? I mean, just in broadest strokes.
Um, so I think in general, obviously we need to be, as educators, but also as academic scholars, we need to be looking at everything. We can't, just because Hitler was a bad guy doesn't mean we shouldn't study Hitler, right? And you shouldn't equate studying Hitler or Carl Schmitt with agreeing with what they did or what they believe. Because obviously, things like that happen. We want to know, understand what happened and how it happened, right? And we can't do that without, starting to read and understand and think about those types of figures. The other issue, though, is that clearly you have to separate the ideas that somebody has from their personal actions and decisions as people. We had, after World War II, the United States hired Werner von Braun, who, was this expert for the Nazis on rocket technology, right? And people objected to that because he was a Nazi. But obviously, rocket science is rocket science. Just because somebody's a Nazi doesn't undermine their rocket science, right? And so you have to be able to separate that as well. That there are certainly ideas need to be evaluated as ideas, separate from the person that developed the ideas, right? And so we have to maintain that separation. Otherwise, you would say, oh, well, this is, rocket science is Nazi science, so we can't do it, which would obviously be absurd. So those are I think, two issues that we have to think about as, I guess, as intellectuals, but also as educators when we're trying to evaluate, the work of people who are, obviously compromised by the types of decisions they made in their lives. But we need to make those kinds of separations. Otherwise, everything gets all blurred because, again, it's about judging different things on their own merits. So judging ideas on the merits of ideas, of how good the ideas are, independent of who developed the idea and how they came into the world.
Yeah, I remember when my wife was in medical school, there was a footnote in a section about hypothermia, and it was a lengthy footnote, and she showed it to me. And the Nazis apparently revolutionized the way that hypothermia is treated by obviously performing these, nefarious experiments on Jews, where it used to be the like common scientific wisdom that if somebody was coming in with, riddled with frostbite and hypothermia, that you would want to slowly warm them up as to not shock their body. And the Nazis, of course, experimented with, Jews who they forcibly gave hypothermia. And they discovered that it actually makes more sense to just, dunk them into hot water as soon as you can. And this is being taught in med schools. And there was sort of this whole footnote about a controversy with the name. It was originally named after the Nazi doctor who had performed it. And then they kept, obviously, the treatment because, as you said before, you're not going to treat hypothermic patients worse because the knowledge came from, Nazi experiments, but they actually changed the name that was associated with it. It's no longer called the, I'm going to butcher the name, but, whatever, the Mr. whatever, method. And it's called, the hot water method or whatever. I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that, or just anything else in general. Just the last thing that I'll ask from you is if people are interested in your campaign, where can they go to get any more information? And then you could conclude with any final ideas.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, they can find out about my campaign at davidpanforcongress.com, David Pan, Pan. I mean, I do think, and I think, some of what we've said indicates that this is that I think we are in a kind of pivotal stage in our history, and that there are really dangerous things that are happening, not just in the United States, but all over the world, that threaten, I think, the fundamental values upon which our country is based. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, equality, basic human rights. those things I think really are in danger all over the world and even within the United States, which is uh, I mean, in some sense, people have gotten used to the idea that there's kind of an inevitable progress in such areas, but that's not the case. And if we want to live in a world, in a country where these basic liberal values are respected, we're really going to have to engage in the process of protecting them.
Awesome. Well, good luck on the campaign. Thank you so much. Hope to see you on campus one of these days. Maybe we can get some coffee, but thank you so much for your
That would
time,
be
David.
great. Yes, thank you very much for having me, and I really enjoyed our conversation as well. Thank you.